Hello friends, I have noticed that my old tank shell guide video has been outdated for quite some time now, and with Battlefield 5 going free to play on some platform and the hype of the next Battlefield building up, more of you have been requesting for an updated video. So here it is. I have a quick disclaimer for the numbers I'm about to show you. I have done my best with calculating these from all the data I have gathered, and they may have a very slight difference, especially with rounding errors in game. And if you find this helpful, give it a thumbs up for the YouTube algorithm. If not, a thumbs down, that's okay too. So, let's get started with the Axis tanks. This is a Panzer XXXVIII, and it is by far one of the best tanks in the game against infantry, and can hold up quite well against tanks if you play smarts. With its HE cannon, it is absolutely insane how much damage you can do to enemy infantry. It has a respectable velocity at 510 meters per second, but the absolute best feature of this shell is really the blast radius at 5 meters and the one hit kill radius at 2 meters. And you can add on the fact that you can dump 25 rounds per minute. It is just mind blowing, and you can run through any objective and capture it for your team with ease. And here, on the top right hand corner, these are the damages you can expect to deal against enemy medium armor, and by medium armor, these refer to armor model BF5 as employed. I have chosen this set of numbers to show because it would be a gigantic table if I have to list every single outcome at different parts of the tank, against different tanks. But I digress. So in the maps with the 38T around, it would refer to the British Valentine tank. Minimum damage here refers to the ricochet damage against the front armor, as if you barely scrape their armor. Normal damage refers to the damage you would typically get by shooting at a slightly off angle shot to a side. Of course, if you can land a nice perpendicular shot, you will see even higher damage. And max damage here means hitting the engine at the best possible angle. So overall, this HE shell does okay against tanks, but its main function is really against infantry. Now, what about if there is an enemy tank around? While it is also equipped with the APCR round, it has a slightly higher velocity at 590 meters per second, which is nice for sniping tanks from afar. The key here is that the 38T would be to utilize its high mobility and sneak up behind enemy tanks for the engine critical shots. Otherwise, its min and normal damage profiles aren't amazing, and you really want to land those sweet 40 plus damage shots. And at 30 rounds per minute, you can take those tanks down in no time. And this is the Puma, and it is a tank that was added on against the Americans. The tank here is really a glass cannon by design. You can use the auto cannons, but most players just abandon that as they unlock more specializations. I would agree because you simply cannot beat the 50mm cannon. The HE shell also has a decent velocity at 550 meters per second, and an average blast radius of 4 meters and a one hit kill radius of 1.6 meters. The damage against tanks is very good for a light frame tank. Its AP shell is also extremely good at sniping Shermans across the map, especially because of the much higher drop the Sherman shells have. And if you catch them off guard, it can deal a whopping 60 plus damage to his engine with just one shot. The combination of a Puma's speed, agility, and its low profile, as well as its relatively high damage cannon, it is a very good choice for armor heavy maps. And what if you want to go with the howitzer route? Well, I have got you covered. Its 75mm HE shell has a massive blast radius at 6.5 meters and a one hit kill radius of 2.4 meters. You can clean out any objective easily, and of course with any howitzer shells, the velocity is going to be much lower. So you will likely need to practice a few shots to get the hang of it. Its damage against tanks is quite lackluster, and if you couple that with a relatively low rate of fire, it makes things even worse. But hold on, you can actually get the AP shell with this cannon. It has a slightly faster velocity, which is nice, but the key point here is that it can deal massive damage against tanks. And when I say massive, it is even slightly more damaging than the Sherman Heat's shell. A nice shot to the Sherman's rear end can deal 70 plus damage, and there's really no recovery for them after that. Moving on to the Panzer IV, which is probably one of the most versatile tanks in the game. If you want to go with the infantry support route, you can run the stubby cannon with flares. This can help your team so much, especially if you're playing aggressively along with supporting infantry players. If you want to be more equipped against tanks, you can upgrade to the Pak 40, which gives you an option for AP or canister shells. For the stubby cannon, it is one of the most devastating shells against infantry in the entire game. And apart from the howitzer shells, this shell has the largest blast radius at 6 meters and a one-shot kill radius of 2.4 meters. It actually matches the main cannon of the Churchill Crocodile in terms of blast radius and rate of fire. Against infantry, it is like a mini crocodile. And I said against infantry because if a tank rolls around the corner, then this may not be the loadout you hoped you had. So if you want to be a little bit more prepared against various threats, perhaps getting the Pak 40 upgrade would be your cup of tea. Its HE cannon has a decent velocity at 530 meters per second, and once again your average one-hit kill radius of 1.6 meters. The damage against tanks is certainly better than your shorter barrel cousin. If you want to still be very effective against infantry, you can also pick the canister shell to go with it. It is extremely effective, especially against infantry who like to peek you with rockets behind rocks. Or if you want to double down on becoming your team's go-to anti-tank demon, then you will want to go with the AP shell. It deals massive damage and affects even more than the Sherman's heat, with a maximum damage of 78 with just one shot. If you catch any tank wandering in the middle of the field with no cover, well, they are going to have a very bad day. Now, moving on to his cousin, the Stug IV. It is extremely similar to the Panzer IV, but does not have a rotating turret, as you probably already know. It is quite a bit less versatile because of that, but if you have a squad mate who doesn't mind sitting in the tank with you, the 360-degree fully protected turrets can be extremely deadly. Otherwise, as you can see, all its cannons have almost identical stats as that of the Panzer IV. We're moving on to the biggest and meanest cat on the battlefield, the Tiger tank. This tank is definitely on the slower side, but can pack a punch in terms of its raw damage outputs. The HE round has a decent speed of 520 meters per second, and also has the largest blast radius in the non-howitzer shell like the Panzer IV stubby cannon. With that said, it does have a slightly lower rate of fire of 15. Its damage against tanks is also no joke. Even as an HE and not AP shell, it can do up to 58 damage to Shermans in one shot. But the real anti-tank build is going to be using a super powerful APCR or Heat T shell. AP shells have an even higher velocity at 620 meters per second, giving you better sniping capabilities as well as huge damage numbers you can deal. Of course, just like any other AP shells, angles really matter, and landing a square on critical shot is going to give you much higher damage. As you can see, a normal shot to the side only deals 36 damage, but a critical to the rear can deal 94 damage. The great thing about going APCR is that you can also run increased ammo capacity, letting you stay in battle even longer before you need to resupply. But if you just want the absolute baddest, meanest, and the most damaging shot that would rip through any armor, then you have to go with the Heat T. It is a little slower at 400 meters per second and has a small blast radius for anti-infantry purposes, but not enough for a one-hit kill unless with direct hits. But this is not why you're using it. You're using this against enemy tanks. With this having some blast damage associated with the shell, even not perfectly landed shot can be devastating. A normal side shot can give you 44 damage against a Sherman, and a critical rear shot will allow you to just simply one-shot the tank. Of course, this will also apply to lighter vehicles like the Staghound and the Greyhound. And last but not least, for the Axis tanks, you have the Sturmtiger squad call-in tank. When used correctly and you have proper supports, this tank can turn the tide of the battle and can be way more useful than a V1 rocket. This tank basically shoots a giant 380mm rocket out and causes a gigantic explosion, leveling structures, group of infantry, cars, tanks, whatever, you name it. For anti-infantry purposes, it has a 12-meter blast radius with a 7-meter one-hit kill radius, which is the largest in the game by a huge margin. It can also one-shot any light or medium tanks regardless of angle. Against heavier tanks, it can deal more than 80 damage and will likely disable their tracks or engines, making a follow-up shot quite easy. And with that said, there is a small learning curve when using this tank, but I have also made a video on how exactly you can land every single shot if you so wish. I have placed a link down in the description. Also, do not forget that there is a spammable second seat in this tank that lets you rain unlimited grenades. Now, moving on to the British tanks. And first, let's talk about the Staghound armored car. This is one of the favorite for really aggressive players. It is very agile, but of course, if you're not careful, you can actually get stuck on rocks and become the Staghound. But otherwise, this is a very good little armored car for anti-infantry purposes, just like the 38T. Its default HE round has a 5-meter blast radius and a 2-meter one-hit kill radius, and this also applies to the HE round with the Little John adapter. The only difference with the Little John adapter is that it has much higher velocity at 770 meters per second as opposed to 530 meters per second. The Little John adapter version actually shoots faster at 30 rounds per minute as opposed to 25 rounds per minute without it. Its damage outputs against tanks with these two rounds are somewhat mediocre, but if you were to go with the AP shell, it has one of the fastest traveling shell at 800 meters per second and a quite respectable damage profile. They can deal as much as 44 damage in the rear against a Panzer IV. Next up, here is a Valentine Mk VIII, and just like the Panzer IV, it is also one of the most versatile tanks in the game. If you want to go with the anti-infantry route, you can use the 2-pounder HE shell and pair that up with the case shell. And I can guarantee you that the enemy infantry will not be happy. And with this HE round, it also has a 5-meter blast radius with a one-hit kill radius of 2 meters. You can also shoot 25 rounds per minute, giving enemy infantry no time to rest. But let's just say you want to be more versatile against tanks, then you have to go with the 6-pounder option. Its HE shell has a decent velocity at 550 meters per second and an average blast radius of 4 meters, and then a one-hit kill blast radius of 1.6 meters. Its damage against tank is actually quite good and can deal up to 42 damage per shot against a Panzer IV. But the real shell you should be going for when shooting at tanks would be its APCR round. It does a massive amount of damage and up to 70 damage per shot at the Panzer IV. Moving on to its cousin, the Valentine Archer. And when this tank was initially introduced into the game, it is one of the best tanks for anti-tank purposes. But after many tweaks, buffs, and nerfs, it is kind of in a spot that isn't terribly bad, but at the same time, it no longer shines. It lacks turrets, and has its engine compartment sticking out in the front for all intents and purposes. But just to cover the tank, its HE shell does slightly more damage than the 6-pounder's equivalent, and is actually capable of using it against other tanks. But if you want to use a dedicated shell against other tanks, then the APDS shell will certainly hurt more, up to 70 per shot, and can travel faster at 750 meters per second. Overall, I still think the Valentine Mk VIII is more versatile and does not have much downsides compared to the Archer. Okay, let's get into the heavy tank category. We are going to start off with the Churchill Mk VII. This tank is actually quite decent in terms of damage output and its tankiness. But the downside is really its mobility, which is quite slow, just like the Tiger. Let's start off with its default HE round. It has a slightly slower speed at 420 meters per second, and a quite good blast radius at 5 meters and a one-hit kill radius at 2 meters. It is also not terrible against tanks, dealing up to 40 damage per shot against a Panzer IV. But of course you would want to use the APC round for that, and can do up to 75 damage per shot. It is of course quite a bit weaker than the Tiger's 88mm cannon, but it does make up for it with its higher rate of fire at 20 rounds per minute. But if you like howitzer type gameplay, then this HE shell is not going to disappoint. With a 7.75 meters blast radius and a one-shot kill radius of 3.1 meters, it is one of the largest in the game. And if you see enemy tanks rolling in, you can quickly switch to the Hesh round and just melt all of them. The Hesh round actually deals mostly the same amount of damage regardless of where you hit and at what angle. You do not need to land perfectly angled shots, and even off-angle shots can give you close to its max damage of roughly 45 to 50 damage. The Churchill also has a different variant, which is the Gun Carrier. and this is your dedicated long-range, sort of anti-everything tank that's especially good at linear maps. Its 3-inch gun with Hachi shell is basically a long-range version of the Panzer IV stubby cannon with a large blast radius of 6 meters and a one-shot kill radius of 2.4 meters. It also has a really amazing velocity at 590 meters per second for an Hachi shell, and even against tanks it can do up to 58 damage per shot against a Panzer IV. And if that's not enough for you, you can go for the Hesh, which does a lot more damage and can do up to 84 damage per shot. But the Hesh on the gun carrier doesn't seem to work the same way as the one on the Mark VII. It sort of acts like a normal shell, and angle still plays a significant role. In fact, since the next option, which is the AP shell, is around, Hesh seems to be a direct downgrade. The AP shell has a very high velocity of 800 meters per second and an even higher damage potential, even allowing you to one-shot a Panzer IV if you land critical hits to its engine. Once again, last but not least, we have yet another variant of the Churchill, which is the squad called in Crocodile. If you have never used this tank, you are definitely missing out. You can stop almost any German armor blitzkrieg with this thing, and is way better than the V1 in many situations. Its biggest land-based threat would be the Sturmtiger, which can kill you in 2 shots, but if they are not accurate with their shots, and you put pressure on them from afar, you can shut it down in no time with a Crocodile. This tank has the toughest armor in the entire game, and literally the best cannon also in the whole game. Apart from specialized howitzer shells, its main HE cannon has the largest blast radius at 6 meters and a one-hit kill radius of 2.4 meters. It also travels at 800 meters per second, like other AP shells in the game. And to top that off, it does even more damage against tanks than a Tiger Heats T. So basically, it has the highest velocity, largest blast radius against infantry, highest damage against tanks in one package. And if that's just not enough, it can also shoot 20 rounds per minute. And the only downside this tank has would be its relatively slower speed, the fact that the trailer can get you stuck at times, and sometimes a teammate would hop in, spraying the flamethrower at nothing, blocking your entire view. Other than that, this can easily be one of the best, if not the best tank in the game. Americans were introduced late to the game, so my previous video did not cover these. So better late than never, and we are going to start with the Greyhound. It was the last tank introduced as a counter to the German Puma. At longer ranges, this is certainly true because Shermans generally have a harder time shooting back at the Puma from afar. But this is not the case for the Greyhound. If you like the Staghound, you would love the Greyhound, apart from the fact that they are both named hounds, but both have a very similar playstyle of being fast and aggressive. While it is not as strong against tanks compared to the Puma, it is definitely quite a bit better against infantry. Let's take a look at the 37mm cannon. It has an average blast radius of 4 meters and a one-hit kill radius of 1.6 meters. It also has a very fast rate of fire at 25 rounds per minute. Against tanks, then you can switch to the AT shell with an even higher rate of fire of 30 rounds per minute, dealing as much as 44 damage per shot to a Panzer IV. Howitzer is also an option for this tank if you like big explosions. It does have a smaller blast radius than other howitzers in the game at 6.5 meters and a one-shot kill radius of 2.4 meters. To compensate for that, it does have a higher rate of fire at 18. The real downside of going with the howitzer routes is that you don't have a dedicated anti-tank option. And with that said, you can equip the HE smoke shell, which actually deals slightly more damage to tanks as well as blinding them in the smoke. This may be quite useful for both offensive and defensive roles to obscure enemies' view. Next up, we are moving to the Pacific with the LVT. This has quite a lot of different loadouts you can choose from: the standard 37mm cannon, or the 75mm tank gun, the 75mm howitzer, or the AA guns. Personally, the AA machine guns is my favorite to use since it is just so good against infantry. and I would use the Sherman if I want to kill other tanks. But for this video, I will go through the various tank shells with you. The default 37mm HE is about average in blast radius and damage to tanks, as you can see. It does have a pretty good rate of fire, so it is certainly quite a valid option. If you see enemy tanks, you can easily swap to the AT shell, which is actually not bad. You can deal up to 44 damage per shot against Type 97 at 25 rounds per minute. And next up will be the 75mm tank gun. It has a slower rate of fire at 20 rounds per minute, the same blast radius as the 37mm, so definitely not as good. Against tanks, it also has a lower damage than the dedicated 37mm AT shell. Unless you really don't like to swap shells, I don't think this is worth using over the 37mm. Another option would be the howitzer. It has a larger blast radius as expected, and a one-shot kill radius of 2.6 meters. But once again, suffers from the same issue the Greyhound has, which is a lack of an anti-tank round. The slightly larger blast radius does not seem to justify its use if you can do a similar, if not a better job with the 37mm. Well, it is time we talk about the Sherman. Despite all the nerfs it received since it was first introduced, it is still a very powerful tank. Let's start off with the 75mm M3 HE. It has a larger than average 5 meter blast radius and a 2 meter one-hit kill radius. Its damage against tanks is definitely not as good, but you can also employ the same strategy as the Greyhound howitzer and use the smoke shells to your benefit. Next up will be the 76mm, which is definitely the go-to option at first, and now probably still is. It does have a lower blast radius at 4 meters and a one-hit kill radius at 1.6 meters. Even without using the heat shell, this can hold its own against other Pacific tanks, dealing as much as 52 damage per shot against a Type 97. Its disadvantages start to arise when facing against German tanks, typically the AP shells with much less drop, allowing them to snipe the Shermans from much further away. The heat shell does bring it closer in terms of damage outputs, dealing up to 72 damage with one shot, but is still behind the Panzer IV's AP shell at 78. And one redeeming point is that the heat shell also has a blast damage associated with it, allowing it to still kill infantry within 1.2 meters with one shot. The Sherman tank also comes with a howitzer option with a decent 7.75 meters blast radius and a 3.1 meter one-shot kill radius. It is quite decent against infantry, and you can also equip the flamethrower with the slowdown. Overall, a pretty fun combination. Okay, and last but not least, let's talk about the Sherman Calliope. It is the squad car Sherman with rockets. And rockets are quite amazing at massive bombardments at enemy strongholds, and can take out enemy tanks in 2 volleys. It shoots less rockets compared to the Japanese Hachi, but can also shoot faster in between. And since this video is about tank shells, let's talk about its main cannon. It is an AT based cannon without splash damage, so it is not as good against infantry. But it is very strong against tanks, dealing up to 81 damage per shot against the Type 97. Now, the last faction, the Japanese, who is exclusively in the Pacific theater. Let's start with the Kami, which is quite similar to the American LVT. The 8.8 machine guns are just as strong as the one on the LVT, but once again, let's discuss the tank shells instead. The 37mm is once again the most versatile, with both the HE cannon having a nice blast radius of 5 meters and a one-shot kill radius of 2 meters, and a very respectable damage output against tanks with the AT shell. The 75mm HE is once again not very useful, as it is both worse than the 37mm HE against infantry and worse than the AP against tanks. The howitzer actually has a larger blast radius than the one on the LVT at 3.1 meters, but does shoot quite a bit slower at 10 rounds per minute. Overall, I think this is still a niche pick and isn't really the most useful. Then moving on to the last spawnable tank, the Type 97. Technically it is 2 different tanks depending on which upgrade you go for, but I am just going to refer it as the Type 97. This tank has quite a unique approach and has quite a few interesting quirks. If you go for the default 57mm cannon, you can upgrade to have the whole 37mm and the 57mm AT round. So, for the 57mm HE, it has a nice blast radius at 5 meters and a one-shot kill radius at 2 meters. It is great for infantry, and if you come across a tank, you can switch to the AT shell, which is quite amazing. With a maximum damage of 53 damage per shot against a Sherman tank at 24 rounds per minute, and if you have a squad mate who wants to hop in, you can also use the whole 37mm cannon, which can also do some additional damage, up to 22 damage per shot. Next up would be the Type 3 HE. It is a do-it-all cannon with an average 4 meters blast radius and a 1.6 meters one-hit kill radius. It does slightly more damage than the 57mm AT, but at a slightly lower rate of fire of 18 rounds per minute. It is like a jack of all trade, master of none cannon. But what about the Type 5 HE then? It has a slightly higher velocity at 520 meters per second, but a lower splash damage at 3 meters and a one-hit kill radius of 1.2 meters, which is the same as the Sherman Heats T, but does slightly higher damage than the Heats at 74 damage to a Sherman's engine. It is basically a dedicated tank killer with a serviceable cannon against infantry. There is also a howitzer option with a large blast radius as usual, but retains the same downside with a lackluster anti-tank performance. Overall, the default 57mm with the AT and hull cannon, or the Type 5 would be the two best choices in my opinion. And really, the last but not least, the squad call-in Hachi. It is a Type 97 on steroids. The rocket barrage can hold down the entire lane on maps like Wake Island or Solomon Island. Apart from that, its main cannon is overall more versatile than the one on the Calliope. It has a good velocity at 550 meters per second, a 5 meter blast radius but a lower one-hit kill radius at 0.75 meters compared to other tank cannons, but it is still better than the Calliope since it doesn't have blast radius at all. The Hachi's anti-tank damage is a tad bit lower than the Calliope's but not by much, dealing a maximum of 74 damage per shot against Sherman compared to 81 on the Calliope. And there you have it! Here are all the tank shells in the game. This took me quite a long time to gather all the info and compile them, but better late than never. I hope you all find this useful, and if you do, feel free to hit the like button. Cheers!